I've been using Zbrush for about 17 years now, 15 out of those professionally. And other software would come and go. I started with 3ds Max, I moved on to Maya as I moved to Canada, and to Blender as I became more independent. But the one common thing throughout my career was Zbrush. The old Pixologic way of licensing was so good for the artists that Zbrush was the first software I ever paid for. I grew up in Brazil in the 90s, so paying for software wasn't something that we normally did. When I first bought Zbrush, it was a little bit hard to justify. I already had a license at work. I wasn't making much money, and it cost me over 600 Canadian dollars. And I wasn't used to paying for software. But I started getting some freelance, and I felt like I needed to support the tool that was allowing me to do the thing that I love. But then every year that passed, I would feel better and better about having bought Zbrush. Not only I was getting free updates every year, which was unheard of, and every single version would bring something so exciting, so new, that we couldn't ever go back to the previous version. In fact, that was one of the fights we had the most with IT at work, was just getting them to update, because like, this is actually going to speed up my work so much if we get the new version. And it was free, so it wasn't much of a fight, but productions, if you work on the industry, you know, they don't like updating software mid-production. And then Maxon bought Zbrush. And there's no such a thing as a perpetual license anymore. And if I decide to update, it will cost me a year, what Zbrush and Pixologic has charged me for 10. So I held back on updating. I didn't want to pay that much money every year. And I was waiting for some new and exciting tool to come out, like Pixologic used to do every year. And something that you just can't work without it anymore, you know? And that never happened. The version that's out from Maxon right now, it's pretty much the same as what I still have, the 2022 version. And it gets worse. Every single studio that I have worked for is still using the old Pixologic Zbrush. So even if I decided to pay Maxon $600 a year, I wouldn't be able to use that professionally, because the files are not backwards compatible. And now they have released Zbrush for iPad. The first thing that Maxon did with Zbrush that got me excited about it again. And the Zbrush for iPad only costs $10 a month, which sounds like a pretty good deal at first, especially when you're comparing to the actual desktop version. But then when you compare to something like Nomad Sculpt that costs a flat $20 for a lifetime license, you see that the $10 a month are not very cheap. But it's Zbrush on the iPad got me pretty excited, right? Like, it's my favorite tool ever on one of my favorite devices ever. So it's kind of like, okay, $10 is not too bad. I'm gonna pay for it. And I start using, and I hate it. Sculpting on it is actually pretty good. That being said, I still prefer Nomad Sculpt over the Zbrush for iPad. But the freedom of being able to start something on the iPad, bring it to the computer, and then back to the iPad, and just like if I go to my in-laws, I can bring the iPad and keep working on whatever I was. So I got pretty excited about the mobility part of it. But that's when the trap became clear. The free version of the iPad is unusable. And this was sculpted in Nomad and just imported here. And why I mean it's unusable? First, they don't have DEM standard included here, which is such a miss. DEM standard is one of the most used brushes for organic sculpting. And they just decided to include like trim dynamic, planar, edge polish, and flatten. 4 or 5 brushes that do the exact same thing in different ways. But then they kept one of the most used brushes out, which is understandable. They wanted you to pay for it. But such a miss, because it makes this version unusable for organic stuff. But okay, let's say you can get by without them standard, you get something done here, and then you go there to export, and guess what? For you to export anything you do here as geometry, you need to pay for the paid version. Okay, understandable, but what's the point of limiting the brushes if you can't use anything that you do here anywhere else? So maybe you can save it, right? Like if you save here, it's a ZPR file, so you can open on the computer. And then I got to the computer, and I tried to open something I started on the iPad. And guess what? My old version of ZBrush can't open anything made on the iPad. That entire cool thing of starting something on the iPad, continuing on the desktop, and doing some details on the iPad again, and back and forth as many times as you want, is only possible for me if I pay $730 Canadian dollars a year for the desktop version, even though I already have a pretty nice and functioning version that I paid for. So if I decided to pay the $10 a month for the iPad version, what do I actually get? I get hundreds of brushes that I only want to use 2 or 3 out of those. I get a bunch of tools that I rather use the desktop for. And then one thing that actually matters is I get the ability to export geometry, like as OBJs. And that will be the only way I can actually use on my desktop anything made on the iPads, because it's not backwards compatible. Only being able to open exported files like OBJs from the iPads on the computer, it's gonna limit my use from the iPads to only conceptual sculptures. But that's how I intended to use ZBrush for iPad to begin with. The problem is, Nomad Sculpt is just as good for that, if not better.